Thomas Whitaker first noticed it on a cold autumn night. The wind howled outside his small suburban home, rattling the old window panes as he sat in his study, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. The soft ticking of the antique clock on his desk was a familiar sound, a steady metronome marking the late hours. It had always been there, ever since he inherited the house from his grandmother, an old thing with a brass frame and Roman numerals that had begun to fade with time. He didn't know why his eyes had wandered toward it at that particular moment, but when they did, he frowned. The second hand, instead of sweeping forward, was moving backward in slow, deliberate ticks. Tick, tick, tick. For a moment, he assumed it was some mechanical error. Perhaps the clock had finally begun to break down. He tapped the glass gently, expecting it to stop or correct itself, but it continued its strange backward march. The digital clock on his computer screen still displayed 11:47 p.m. He looked back at the antique clock, 11:46. A chill ran through him. He blinked. When he looked again, the time was 11:45. His chest tightened. He turned toward the wall clock in the hallway. It, too, was ticking backward. A sudden nausea rose in his stomach. He shut his laptop, rubbing his temples. He was probably just tired. Maybe it was some bizarre trick of his overtired mind. He went to bed trying to ignore the eerie sensation that something was terribly, terribly wrong. It wasn't a one-time occurrence. Over the next few weeks, Thomas found himself catching the clocks in the act at odd intervals. Sometimes they behaved normally. Other times, he would glance at his watch and realize time was slipping in reverse. Never for long, never dramatically, just a few minutes here and there. No one else seemed to notice. At work, in the office filled with the sound of typing and hushed conversations, he'd glance at the wall clock and see the hands shivering in place before inching backward. But when he asked a coworker what time it was, they would answer normally, as if nothing strange had happened at all. At home, his microwave clock would shift back by a few minutes whenever he wasn't looking. His phone, his laptop, digital devices remained unchanged, but anything with moving hands seemed off. He tried to shake it off as stress. Maybe it was a quirk of his mind. After all, he had been feeling more exhausted than usual lately. He told himself that even as a gnawing unease settled deep in his bones. One evening, as Thomas sat in his study again, he decided to document it. He took out an old leather-bound journal he had barely used and began writing. October 13th. Noticed the clocks again. This time, it was the grandfather clock in the hall. Watched it move from 9:37 to 9:36. No one else seems to see it. The next morning, the entry was gone. The page was there, blank, untouched. No sign of ink, no indentations, no smudges, as if he had never written anything at all. His hands went cold as he flipped through the journal. Had he imagined it? No, he was sure he had written something, but the evidence was gone. A strange, creeping fear began to settle over him, a feeling of something unseen coiling at the edges of his reality, just beyond his grasp. And then, without realizing it, he started to forget things. The first time Thomas forgot something significant. It was small. A coffee shop he used to visit regularly, gone. Not just from his schedule, but from his memory. He walked down Main Street one morning, looking for the place where he knew it should be. He could picture the cozy little storefront, the way the barista always smiled at him when he ordered his usual black coffee. But as he reached the spot where it should have been, there was nothing, just a blank stretch of brick, as if nothing had ever been there. He stood there for a long time, staring at the wall, feeling something missing inside his head, something hollow. He checked his phone for the name of the place, but no search result matched what he remembered. No records, no reviews, no signs that it had ever existed at all. He told himself maybe he had misremembered. Maybe the cafe had closed down, and he just hadn't noticed. But something about it felt wrong. Not just forgotten, but erased. Then the gaps grew larger. One evening, Thomas sat in his apartment, watching an old movie he had always loved. Or at least, he thought he had loved it. The scenes played out on the screen, but something was missing. He couldn't recall the ending, couldn't remember the names of the actors. It felt unfamiliar, like something he had never seen before. Had he imagined liking it? Had he even seen it at all? The next day, he asked a coworker about a project they had been working on together. The man frowned at him, confused. What project? Thomas blinked. The one we started last week. But as soon as the words left his mouth, they sounded uncertain. Had there been a project? He struggled to remember details, but the more he reached for them, the more they crumbled like dry paper in his mind. His coworker shook his head and returned to his work. Thomas sat back at his desk, breathing shallowly. Something was happening to him. Days passed, and more pieces of his life disappeared. A high school friend he had exchanged emails with, gone. He searched through his inbox for old messages, but there were none. No saved contacts, no social media records, no photos. As if the person had never been real. He sat frozen at his desk, heart pounding. This was beyond forgetfulness. This was something deeper. He tried to fight it. He wrote names, dates, details in his journal, desperate to hold on to them. But every morning, the pages were blank again. He started using his phone to record voice memos, but they deleted themselves overnight. The files simply weren't there when he woke up. Reality itself was unraveling around him. One evening he visited his parents' house. He hadn't been there in weeks, but something in his gut told him he needed to see them. The drive was quiet, the roads eerily empty. When he pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had. Modest, with a red door and a small porch light, glowing in the early evening. But something felt off. When he stepped inside, the air smelled sterile, like a house that hadn't been lived in for a long time. His mother's favorite armchair was missing. The family photos that had once lined the hallway were gone. And then, his parents weren't there. He walked from room to room, calling their names. Nothing. Their bedroom was neatly made, but the closet was empty. Their belongings were gone, as if they had never lived there at all. Panic gripped his chest. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He searched for Mom, but there was no number, no text history. He checked for his father's name. Nothing. A deep, primal terror clawed at his mind. He ran to the bookshelf, looking for old photo albums, proof that his family had existed. But when he opened them, every page was blank. No pictures, no handwriting, just empty white sheets. The world was swallowing him, one memory at a time. At work, fewer people seemed to recognize him. His desk, once cluttered with papers and office supplies, grew emptier each day. One morning, he arrived to find it completely cleared. No computer, no chair, no one questioned it. He tried to call his landlord, but the number didn't exist. When he returned home that night, the key wouldn't fit the lock. The apartment door was different. newer, freshly painted, as if he had never lived there at all. He pounded on the door. No one answered. Neighbors passed by in the hallway, but none of them recognized him. His name felt foreign in his own mouth. Who am I? The thought chilled him. He ran back to his car, hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. He had to find someone who remembered him, someone who could prove that he was real. But as he drove through town, the streets felt unfamiliar. Buildings were different. Storefronts he knew were replaced by businesses he didn't recognize. It was as if the town itself was shifting, rewriting itself, pushing him out of existence. He sped toward his childhood home. Maybe, just maybe, there would be something left. But when he arrived, there was only an empty lot. No house, no street number, no signs that a home had ever stood there. The wind howled through the vacant space, rustling the dry autumn leaves around his feet. Thomas Whitaker stood there, heart pounding in his chest, as the last fragments of his past slipped through his fingers. He was disappearing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The world around Thomas was crumbling, yet no one seemed to notice. He walked through town, but the streets were unfamiliar, warped versions of what they used to be. The people who passed him had faces he didn't recognize, and they looked through him as if he weren't there at all. Something gnawed at his mind, a deep, insidious nothingness that spread like a disease. He could feel himself slipping, his very presence unraveling thread by thread. He tried to remember his name, but it felt hollow, like an echo of something that had once mattered, but was now fading into obscurity. Thomas Whitaker. That was his name, wasn't it? Or had it ever been? His footsteps carried him aimlessly through the shifting streets, past buildings that no longer held any meaning. The air felt heavier, thick with something unseen, as if the fabric of reality was pressing down on him. His stomach twisted as he passed a shop window and caught his reflection. Or rather, the lack of it. There was no face staring back at him, no form, no shadow, just an empty pane of glass reflecting the world behind him. His breath hitched. His hands shot up to touch his face, to feel the shape of himself, but his fingers met only emptiness. He turned, desperate, searching for anyone, someone, who could see him, who could confirm that he still existed. But the people on the street walked past as if he were nothing more than a gust of wind. His heart pounded in his hollow chest. No, he was real, wasn't he? He ran, through alleyways, through empty lots where buildings should have been, through streets that twisted in on themselves like a maze with no exit. But there was nowhere left to go. Everything was unraveling faster now. The edges of the world flickered like a candle's flame struggling against the wind. He turned a corner and found himself on an unfamiliar street. No, that wasn't right. It should have been familiar. It should have been his old neighborhood. But the houses were wrong. The trees were wrong. The sky above him wasn't the soft blue of early evening, but something vast and colorless. A void stretching endlessly above, swallowing the light. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed against the old leather-bound journal, his last tether to reality. He flipped it open, desperate, searching for any sign of the words he had written. Blank. Every page was blank. He frantically turned them, one after another, faster and faster, as if by sheer will he could force the ink to return, to prove that his memories had been real. But the pages remained empty. The ink, the words, the proof of his existence, erased, His hands shook as he stared at the empty book. His breath came in ragged gasps. His mind felt fragmented, pieces slipping through cracks he couldn't close. Had he imagined everything? Had he ever been here at all? A cold wind swept through the empty streets, rustling the pages of the journal. And then, the pages began to vanish. One by one, they peeled away from the binding, dissolving into the air like wisps of smoke. He reached out, trying to catch them, but his fingers passed through nothing. The journal itself disintegrated in his hands, crumbling into dust. His last connection to the world, gone. Something deep inside him cracked. He staggered to his feet, staring at the empty space where the book had been. And then, he felt it. The nothingness. It was inside him now, gnawing at the edges of his being, erasing him piece by piece. His fingertips blurred, dissolving like mist. His arms, his legs, vanishing. His breath came in short, gasping exhales as he clutched his chest, trying to hold himself together. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The world around him dimmed, as if the very fabric of reality had grown tired of acknowledging his presence. The sky above flickered. The buildings, the streets, the people. Everything became hazy, indistinct, fading into a blur of muted colors. And then, darkness. There was no pain, no fear, just an eerie, suffocating stillness. And then, a sound, a soft ticking, faint at first, distant, like a whisper from a forgotten place. But it grew louder, steady, rhythmic. Tick, tick, tick. A clock. Somewhere, in the void, a clock was still ticking. Slowly, carefully, he opened his eyes and found himself in a dimly lit room, his study. The antique clock on his desk ticked quietly, the second hand moving in slow, deliberate sweeps. The air smelled of old books and coffee. A lamp cast a soft glow over a leather-bound journal resting on the desk in front of him. His fingers twitched. He reached out, hesitating, and flipped the cover open. The pages inside were filled with ink, words, his handwriting. The last entry, October 13th. Noticed the clocks again. This time, it was the grandfather clock in the hall. Watched it move from 9:37 to 9:36. No one else seems to see it. His breath hitched. It was exactly where he had started. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? He turned the pages frantically, scanning for more entries. But the words blurred, shifting, twisting into something unreadable. And then, the ink began to fade. No, not again. He gripped at the edges of the book, watching helplessly as the words dissolved, leaving behind blank pages. The ticking of the clock grew louder. He looked up, eyes wide, and saw the hands moving. Backward. A cold realization settled over him. This wasn't a second chance. This was the cycle beginning again. His fingers trembled as the last of the ink vanished from the pages. The journal was empty. And soon, so would he be. The clock's ticking grew slower, softer, fainter, and then nothing.